And speaking of people who create things and found things and make things that change the world, our special spiritual guest today is actually a first for us, meaning that he is a second. This is the second time that Reverend Shad Groverland has been our guest. We've never done that before. And the reason that we are having Reverend Shad on a second time is that when he was on the first time, he was talking about the denomination in which he is an ordained minister and for which he was at that time CEO. And this was Unity Worldwide Ministries. And the reason that we talk maybe a little bit more about Unity than about some other kinds of denominations is because the founders were vehemently vegetarian, as close to vegan as people got in the 1890s. And things have changed there a little bit. Shad's going to talk with us about some of that. And he has gone out and done something very creative on his own. And one reason we wanted to talk to him today is that I know that many of the people who come here for spiritual solace may have left spiritual communities. And, but maybe you left not as a clergy member, not as someone powerful in that organization, but you still knew it was kind of tough. And following your inner light is always the right thing to do, but maybe not always the easiest. So with all that in mind, welcome, Reverend Shad Groverland.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it is exciting to hear what you've got going out there. So give us a little bit of update between when you were here last and what's going on now.
Sure. Well, I'll preface it with, you've probably heard people use the phrase, I didn't leave my party left me. And oftentimes when they're talking about politics, I didn't leave my party left me. And in many ways, that's what I've experienced in my denomination or my faith, or whatever you want to call it, recently, actually over a period of time. So referring to Unity and Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. So I was the CEO of Unity Worldwide Ministries. And in that position, I've always been very passionate about the teachings of our founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who, as you stated, were vegetarian, borderline vegan, possibly vegan at times. And just the truth teachings they had were so inspiring to me and so important to me. I worked really hard to make that a key component again of what we were doing at Unity Worldwide Ministries, and doing a lot of phenomenal work in that organization. But that was one of those things I really want to get back to. And the organization itself is expanding in how it perceives spirituality, and very similar to what we're doing here in this space. And for me personally, what they were doing really centered around what they called practical Christianity. It was really the Christian perspective of this expansive idea of a God that's not just outside us in the clouds, but it's in and around and moving through us as this divine entity. So I was released from my position because really where I was going and the organization we're going in two different directions, and we sort of blessed each other on our way, and that was that. And so I was left with thinking about what's next, and do I go and take on a church? Do I continue what I was doing before? And for my wife and I, it just really became apparent that we so love that really foundational message of these founders that we wanted to continue that. And the really only way to do that and to really make sure it is that was to start our own church here, where they were doing their work, where they brought practical Christianity to the Lee Summit and Kansas City area. So that's what we're doing. We forego the easy part of just getting a job and getting a paycheck and going back to that, to launching a new church, which means we're going out on a limb and faith that it's all going to take off, which it feels like it is. And so that's where we're headed.
And what's it called?
It's called Fillmore Church.
So honoring the founders, that's so cool. Now, I know one of the things that you've been interested in, Reverend Shad, is bringing more of a Christian message. It was bringing more of a Christian message back to Unity. And my understanding is the Fillmore Church is a Christian denomination. And yet some of the ideas, such as being plant forward, we'll talk about that in a minute, the inclusiveness and some of these things that are part of practical Christianity aren't what a lot of people think of today when they hear that word. So how do you get all that to work together?
Well, first is acknowledging what beauty there is in Christianity, even fundamental Christianity and traditional Christianity. And if anyone has triggers around that, that it's really time to heal that. And because we've all have probably Christian friends or relatives, and they're really beautiful people. And recognizing that there's people within the Christian denominations that are looking for something a little bit more expansive, something might be a little bit more open-minded, something might have a little different perspective on the Bible and how they see that. And a lot of them are exiting the Christian churches right now, or they're thinking about it. And that's really where we want Fillmore Church to be welcoming, to be the open door. If someone's looking for a different church experience, that's where they can step into is Fillmore Church. So you kind of, you've got a spectrum from, real evangelical Christianity to interfaith, animal organization we've got right here. There's a lot of segments along the way, a lot of steps along the way, but we want to sit sort of right here where someone's just stepped out of their church or they're just thinking about stepping out of church. They're still Christian and they still love church and they still love the Bible and still love those things, but they're feeling like there's something different going on. They're reading something different in Jesus's message than being shared to them from the pulpit. And there's an inner calling for something more. Well, we want to answer that. And that's what I really feel Charles and Myrtle Fillmore specifically were doing in the time they were doing it. They were serving that demographic. It's how do we take Christianity deeper? We don't abort it. We don't just give up on it. It's doing great things, but how do we take it a little bit deeper? How do we give a different perspective on the Bible? And so we want to sit right in that spot. And that's really where I feel like my jam is, and my wife and I, that's just, it's an awesome spot to be.
So where in Christianity, as you see it, does kindness, respect for non-human beings enter in?
I don't know a place where it doesn't enter in. If we're going to just get to the very fundamental basics of it, is thou shalt not kill. And there's no asterisk at the end of that says, and that only applies to humans, or that only applies to your family members, or that only applies to people within your country. It's just thou shalt not kill. Now, that's a pretty lofty goal to reach because there's tiny little organisms around us all the time that we're accidentally stepping on, or we're scratching off our skin, all sorts of things. So I like to bring everything back to, we are aspiring to do the best we can with what we have and everything we do. Even when we are doing Plant Forward, or we're talking about politics, we're talking about how I should to be a better person. We're not shooting for perfection. We're aspiring to do the best we can. So that's where we want to land things is thou shalt not kill. All right. Well, I, of course, have accidentally driven over an ant on my way here, but I'm doing the best I can to be aware of not doing any more harm than I consciously am doing. And so in that sense, I think that message resonates throughout the Bible. And you see the Bible as a progression from sacrifice in the early forms of the Bible to later getting on to, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And then we're becoming more aware and more aware. And it's this really beautiful journey of humanity, sort of learning how to engage with each other, nature, and everything else around it to become more aware.
And one of the other things that you very much are in harmony with the Fillmores is the idea of a healing ministry. And I've read in some places, oh, that's old-fashioned. Yeah, we can see why somebody like Mary Baker Eddy would have come up with Christian Science when she did, and the other New Thought churches that had healing as part of their ministry because they didn't have antibiotics yet. We don't need that stuff now. And yet with the Fillmore Church, you're bringing the healing back. Tell us about that.
Well, when you look at the world today, we've got the most advanced medicine we've ever had on the planet. We have the most expensive, healthcare system probably in the world in this country, and people are sicker than they've ever been. So fundamentally, if it was working, we should be the healthiest we've ever been. So we might be living longer, but we're living longer sicker. So something's still amiss. And when we look at, if you're trying to see the body as just a physical form that you deal with chemical solutions, then you're missing a larger picture. You have mind, body, soul. You have this threefold nature of us. And if you're trying to just teach or treat one aspect of that, you've done sectionalism, and it's just never going to be as successful as you look at the holistic system. So I think that's part of what Myrtle's realization was when she healed herself of tuberculosis, just using affirmations and denials of her mind, denying the power that an illness has over her. For her, it was tuberculosis, and affirming the power that she has to be a whole and beautiful being without this ailment. And so that is possibly still the most powerful form of healing in the world today, because one, it's our power. We're not paying some outside source to take care of it for us. It doesn't come with side effects that we have to list off on a giant carton to say, or a commercial at the end that's railing off all the side effects. It's already within us. And so it's really acknowledging that if I'm a child of God, you really think about it, if I'm a child of God, if I'm a child of this infinite perfection and this infinite knowledge, I would have to have the knowledge and perfection within myself to heal and to be whole. And so that's really one of the key things that the Fillmores had going into this experience. We really want to bring that back into this church. And we honor any form of medicine that someone uses that works for them. There is no shame in that. We all go to what works for us. That decision's between us and God. But to remind ourselves of this incredible power we have to heal ourselves and to help heal the people around us with just the power of the words, the thoughts, with prayers, with meditation, and diet and exercise and everything else we know to do.
That's very forward, not to mention plant forward, which is another phrase that's come up about the Fillmore Church. Tell us what that means in connection to what you guys are doing out there.
So absolutely. So all the way through Myrtle Fillmore's passing, they were very big on being vegetarian, being vegan, being very aware of our impact on animals and around us. And I'm just going to read exactly what they had written out of this book that some people might recognize here. I'm sure Carol is going to recognize this book. They wrote 32 statements of faith. These are the 32 core tenets of what they believe. And they say, we believe that all life is sacred and that man should not kill or be party to the killing of animals for food. Also, that cruelty, war, and wanton destruction of human life will continue so long as men destroy animals. So they had this really expansive concept that it's not just what we do to animals affect us personally, which we might recognize as karma if we're going to talk about the Hindu faith, but really that what we do to animals is affecting all of us globally, because it's a consciousness of better than gets to do harm on the lesser than. And regardless of how you break that out in any individual section, whether it's me over a cat or over a mouse or whatever it is, that single seed thought germinates into all of creation. And now we can have war because one country's better than gets to do harm on a lesser than, one nation, one state, one group of people, and that spreads through everything we do. So really, if we can trace it back to this seed thought that we don't have right to do harm to another, that goes back to how we eat, how we live, what we wear, all these things. So that really was an important part of what they were doing while Myrtle Fillmore was alive. And then after her passing, it started to drift out of the organization over time. So I think the real magical time for this work of practical Christianity that they were doing was while Myrtle and Charles were doing it together, both alive. There was something powerful about that union, and they're doing amazing things. So that's where the Fillmore Church is going to focus our efforts, is that time frame, looking at it from a modern perspective, but the work they did at that time.
And that's one of the things that I'm fascinated by what you're doing, because you remind me very much of what I understand of the history of unity and what the Fillmores were doing early on. And yet you're doing it in such a modern context. So your church is in a co-working space, very much 2024.
Right.
So tell us a story about Charles Fillmore and a picnic.
This is Carol's laughing already. This is sort of the story keeps getting handed down. The basic concept of the story is that you have a picnic on the grounds at Unity Village, and of course, different people are bringing different things. And Charles Fillmore comes out to the table where all the food is sprouted and finds out that they have meat hot dogs there. And obviously, he's vegetarian. Myrtle's vegetarian, and the story goes that he's quite upset at that. To the point that he actually takes one of the hot dogs and he nails it to a tree around the picnic area. What statement he was trying to make there, whether he was comparing it to Jesus or something else, I don't know, but it was a pretty bold move, and it's bold enough that we still talk about it today. It was probably almost 100 years ago when it happened.
Well, that's very cool. May people talk about all of us 100 years from now. So when you were talking about what you had been trying to do within the framework of the Unity organization. And it seemed like that thinking was going in kind of two ways. You were going more toward practical Christianity, you had your plant forward message, and you had a lot of interest in these. Is it 38 tenants?
32.
32, and we'd probably find six more. Uh, and it seems like your colleagues there were wanting to go in a freer way. Now, it's interesting for those of us here at the Compassion Consortium. I think we're all very into the idea of freedom. We're very much into the idea of don't tell me what to do. And yet, on the other hand, there's a certain rigor to parameters. So tell us what you think about parameters and religions and where we get the balance.
So I did a lot of traveling with my wife, visiting a lot of different ministries, not just Unity ministries, different ministries as we were traveling. And you find that if you don't have guardrails, you don't have direction, right? A river has banks, and those banks allow a river to flow. If you don't have those banks, the water goes horizontal, it sits, becomes stagnant, and becomes dangerous. So there's something about having guardrails, having banks, so we're all moving and flowing in the same direction. And I think that's crucially important for this time because there's this swell of independence coming out, which is beautiful, but that also can get attached to ego. That I'm going to do whatever I want, when I want it, however I want it, and that's not necessarily a healthy place to be in. So having an organization that says that's great, but here, when you're with us, we do it within the confines of these guardrails to help you move forward in your progression. Because without this, you might just be bouncing around like a ping pong, and you try this religion this day, and then this religion this day, and then when you get to the hard part of that religion, you jump over to this one. But really, any spiritual path is going to get to a point where it becomes more difficult because you're starting to challenge the ego and challenge the aspects of yourself that need to change. And if we keep jumping to the next religion every time we meet that point on that path where we're supposed to be challenging and pushing through, we're never moving through. So it can become a buffet of the nice things from each faith and a buffet of the nice things from each religion, but never none of the actual difficult things from those that were there to actually push you through to that next breakthrough. So we're really just sort of jumping around the fun stuff, and really the fruitful stuff is what we're leaving out. And so some spiritual leaders, Paramahansa Yogananda would say you get spiritual indigestion because you've just been eating of the spiritual buffet.
Oh, I love that. Well, no more spiritual indigestion. I think there's a brilliant idea, I think, for all of us at the Compassion Consortium, is just this idea of keeping the focus on what's a little bit higher. That probably sounds like a hymn or something. A little bit higher, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more of bringing everybody in. And that sounds a lot like you too, Reverend Shad Groverland. So blessings on you and the Fillmore Church. We'll be so excited to see where things go there. And what's the website?
Quite easy, fillmore.church.
That's easy.